The battlefield shimmered with the golden hues of a rising sun, its rays piercing through a haze of ash and smoke. Sylva stood at the crest of a shattered hill, her silhouette sharp against the chaos below. Clad in divine mail that gleamed like molten silver, forged in the same celestial fires as her blades, she was a vision of grace and power. The armor clung to her lithe frame like a second skin, its faint radiance pulsing in rhythm with Thalorin and Sindralith, her twin swords. As she moved, her blades sang. Thalorin thrummed with a deep, resonant tone, steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Sindralith, in contrast, shrieked, a piercing, chaotic wail, its fiery aura cracking the air with violent energy. Together, their melodies formed an otherworldly harmony, a sound that foreshadowed devastation. Sylva's emerald eyes burned with unyielding fire as she surveyed the advancing wave of soldiers. Her chest rose as she drew a breath, steady and purposeful, before releasing a cry that tore through the battlefield. Surrender! The word thundered across the plain, its force rippling through the ranks of her enemies. It wasn't just a command, it was a decree, a challenge that demanded obedience. The ground beneath her feet quivered as her voice carried, resonating with power and intent. The soldiers faltered. Some froze, their weapons wavering mid-swing, while others turned wide-eyed, gripped by fear. Their hesitation hung in the air, fragile and fleeting. "Or face the wrath of my blades," she roared, her voice cutting through the din like a blade of its own. Thalorin's radiance intensified, casting waves of brilliance that washed over the battlefield like the dawning of a new age. Sindralith burned brighter, its fiery energy warping the air, leaving trails of ash and embers in its wake. Then Sylva moved. Thalorin struck first, its golden arc slicing the air with deliberate precision. A soldier raised his shield, but the blade's resonance slowed him, freezing his movements as if time itself had been halted. The shield shattered into jagged fragments that hung in the air for a moment before scattering like shards of glass across the blood-soaked ground. Sylva twisted smoothly, stepping through the temporal stillness. Sindralith followed with devastating finality, slashing through the soldier's armor and cleaving him in half. His body collapsed in opposing directions, the remnants of his weapon tumbling from limp fingers. Nearby, another soldier lunged forward, his spear angled for Sylva's chest. She sidestepped with an almost casual grace, her armor radiating a faint, otherworldly shimmer as if responding to her movements. Thalorin hummed softly as it swept upward, severing the spear shaft in a single elegant motion. The soldier stumbled, his footing lost. Sylva's grip tightened on Sindralith, her piercing gaze fixed as she drove the fiery blade downward in a punishing strike. The weapon ignited his armor, splitting him from collarbone to waist in a burst of molten sparks. The battlefield churned with chaos. Blood stained the earth in dark rivers, and the air reeked of smoke and iron. Sylva moved through the carnage like a shadow, her movements a lethal manifestation of her intent. Two opponents closed in, their swords raised high. Thalorin intercepted the first strike, vibrating with a low resonance that left the attacker's arm trembling, his weapon dropping lifelessly to the earth. Sylva pivoted, her footwork a flawless dance as Sindralith lashed out, its scorching edge cutting through the second soldier's armor and flesh in a single fluid motion. The man's scream was brief as his body crumpled, trailing embers and smoke in its fiery path. The battlefield finally stilled, the chaotic symphony of battle replaced by the eerie quiet of smoldering ruins. The cries of the wounded blended with the distant crackle of flames, the air heavy with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Sylva stood amidst the carnage, her twin swords humming faintly as their light dimmed. Her armor pulsed softly, a faint reminder of the ethereal energy that sustained her. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself despite the weight of exhaustion pulling at her limbs. For now, the field was hers, the immediate danger vanquished. But as she gazed out at the distant horizon, her resolve hardened. This victory was but one thread in a larger tapestry. The war was far from over. A massive figure emerged from the fray, a towering brute wielding two colossal axes, his roar shaking the ground as he charged. Sylva's focus narrowed, her grip tightening on her swords. The hulking opponent swung both axes in brutal arcs, the sheer force of his strikes carving deep furrows into the battlefield. Sylva sidestepped one blow, the ground beneath her feet splattered with fresh blood. Thalarin struck first, its golden arc grazing his armor, time slowing around him as his movements grew sluggish. The giant bellowed, struggling against the temporal distortion, his axes faltering mid-swing. Sylva moved with deadly precision, her steps deliberate. She targeted every exposed weakness. Sindralith slashed across his unprotected thigh, flames erupting as molten steel burned through flesh. The brute staggered, dropping one of his axes. Sylva circled him, her emerald gaze unyielding, before driving Thalarin upward into the gap beneath his ribcage. The resonance rippled through his massive frame, freezing him in a moment of agony. With a final flourish, Sylva leapt into the air, both swords humming with celestial might. She brought Sindralith crashing down in a cross-slash, splitting the giant's chest open in an eruption of fire and golden light. His axes tumbled to the ground with a deafening clang as he collapsed, lifeless, into the blood-soaked dirt. The battlefield began to quiet, the chaos fading into eerie stillness. The cries of the wounded mingled with the crackle of flames. Around her, the remnants of the enemy force lay broken, their weapons shattered and their bodies strewn across the sodden earth. Sylva stood at the heart of the carnage, her sacred weapons emitting a faint resonance as their glow faded. Her armor glowed faintly, as though imbued with a life force that pulsed in harmony with her will. She fell to one knee, her breath escaping in heavy bursts, despite her best effort to steady herself. The exhaustion tugged at her limbs like chains, but she refused to let it consume her. For now, the fight was over, but the war was far from won. Hidden deep within the heart of an ancient forest, the sanctuary stood cloaked beneath towering trees whose whispers carried secrets to the wind. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the faint glow of ethereal light danced between the branches, as if the forest itself had a soul. Sylva limped along the narrow path, her breath shallow, each step a reminder of the toll her battle had taken. Her armor, though still radiant, bore the faint scars of combat, and her body ached from bruises she hadn't yet tended to. At last, the path revealed a glade awash in golden-green light, its brilliance spilling across the forest floor like a radiant mosaic of light. At its center stood an ancient stone altar, worn smooth by time and inscribed with runes that seemed to hum faintly as she approached. Beside it waited an elder draped in robes of deep forest green, their face obscured by a hood that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows. "You've come," the elder said, their voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of centuries. They gestured for Sylva to approach. "Lay your burdens here." Sylva hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of her choices pressed down on her like an invisible force. The heft of Thalarin and Sindralith in her grasp seemed greater than ever, as if the swords shared her exhaustion. She set them gently on the altar, their light fading softly as they came to rest upon the stone. Her celestial mail shimmered faintly, as though exhaling the weight of battle. "You fought well," the elder continued, their hood tilting slightly as they studied her. "But your fight is far from over." Sylva met their gaze, her emerald eyes shadowed with doubt and a flicker of self-reproach. "The battle, it was only one skirmish, and it nearly broke me. How can I carry this burden? These swords, this power, it feels as though it's more than I." "Then you deserve," the elder interrupted, "or more than you can wield." Sylva's silence was answer enough. The elder stepped closer, an enigmatic aura radiating from them, equal parts solace and quiet authority. They reached out, their hand hovering over Thalarin. The golden blade hummed softly, its light flickering like a heartbeat. These weapons were forged by the fates themselves. Threads of time and destiny are woven into their essence and into you. "Why me?" Sylva's voice cracked, the gravity of the question pressing down harder than the swords she bore. "Why was I chosen?" The elder's gaze lingered on her, their silence stretching into the space between her words. Finally, they spoke, their voice heavy with solemnity. "You were chosen because you were broken. The fates do not weave perfect threads, they weave what is necessary." Sylva's breath hitched, memories flickered unbidden, a village engulfed in flames, the screams of the people she couldn't save, the acrid taste of smoke as she fled into the night. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "I was weak, I ran." And yet you stand here now, the elder said gently. The past may not bind you, but it lays the foundation for the threads you weave in the present. The runes on the altar flared with renewed brilliance, their melodic hum intertwining with the pulsating energy of the swords. The elder turned their attention to Sindralith, the fiery blade pulsing with restless energy. This power will test you, Sylva. It will demand sacrifices, but it was not given to you by chance. The fates saw your pain and wove it into strength. Sylva's gaze fell to the swords. The gentle radiance of Thalarin and the searing glow of Sindralith seemed to intertwine, creating a rhythm that felt both comforting and unsettling. She reached out, her fingers brushing their hilts. "And what if I fail?" The elder stepped back, their voice a whisper now, carried by the wind. "Then the threads unravel, but if you trust in what you have become, you will find the path forward." Sylva's hand tightened around the hilts of her swords. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she lifted them once more. Their light flared, brighter than before, casting shadows that danced like specters around the glade. "Rest now," the elder said, their tone softening. "The forest will protect you tonight. But when dawn comes, the road will demand more of you." Sylva nodded, her resolve hardening. As she settled against the base of a tree, the sounds of the forest surrounded her, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. She closed her eyes, the weight of the day easing slightly as she allowed herself a moment of stillness. And in the silence, she could sense it, the intricate threads of her past and future weaving together, fragile yet enduring. The whispers of the divine were quiet now, but their promise lingered. Tomorrow, she would face whatever awaited. For now, she would dream. The forest was dense and suffocating, its canopy thick with shadow. Sylva moved like a whisper through the underbrush, her ethereal armor dulled to blend seamlessly with the shadowed forest, avoiding any telltale glint of light. Her twin swords, Thalarin and Sindralith, rested at her sides, their hums muted, as though sensing the need for stealth. Every step she took was deliberate, her ears attuned to the faintest rustle of leaves or crack of a branch. The informant's trail had led her here, to the outskirts of a ruined village swallowed by time. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and damp earth. Crumbled stone buildings peeked through the overgrowth, their silence broken only by the occasional call of a crow. It was here that she would find them, the one who had betrayed her people. Sylva paused, her piercing gaze scanning the ruins. Her breath remained steady, though an unshakable tension coiled in her chest. This wasn't a battlefield of chaos and glory. It was a hunt in the shadows, laced with the uncertainty of what she would find. Trust, fragile as spun glass, lay shattered in her heart, leaving behind a void that churned with unresolved bitterness. A faint sound caught her attention, voices low and urgent. She moved toward them, her steps soundless. The ruined walls of the village provided ample cover, and she pressed herself against a crumbling archway, peering around the edge. There they were. The informant stood in the center of a clearing, flanked by 3 enemy scouts. Their posture was rigid, their hand gesturing animatedly as they spoke. Sylva couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear, an exchange of information. The scouts listened intently, their weapons gleaming faintly in the dim light. Sylva's grip on Thalarin tightened. The blade's golden glow stirred faintly, but she willed it silent. A direct confrontation now would be reckless. She needed to know more. "I don't have time for your excuses," one of the scouts growled, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "We need the next target. Your delay puts the entire plan at risk." The informant's response was muffled, but the tone carried a hint of fear. Sylva's stomach twisted. This wasn't just betrayal, it was cowardice. The scouts turned abruptly, their conversation finished. 2 moved into the forest, leaving the informant with 1 remaining guard. Sylva watched them go, her mind racing. This was her moment. She stepped from the shadows, her presence a quiet storm. "You have 1 chance to explain yourself." The informant spun to face her, their face pale. "Sylva, I don't." Her voice was sharp, slicing through the silence with deadly clarity. "You betrayed us. You've endangered everyone I've fought to protect. Why?" The guard stepped forward, his weapon raised in a futile challenge. Sylva's emerald eyes narrowed, her expression cold and calculating. She crossed her swords in an X-shaped stance, the glowing blades crackling with opposing energies that surged with unstoppable force. With a single, devastating motion, she swung them outward in a cross slash, Thaloran tearing through his armor like a shard of pure light, while Sindralith ignited his form in a cascade of fire and molten steel. The impact unleashed a shockwave that rippled through the village, scattering shards of his armor and sending his lifeless body crumpling into the blood-soaked ground. Her strikes were deliberate, her dominance unquestionable. Yet satisfaction eluded her. Only the acrid bitterness of duty remained, a cold testament to her resolve. Sylva turned back to the informant, her emerald gaze ablaze with fury. "Speak." They hesitated, their hands trembling. "I didn't have a choice. They threatened my family, my life. What was I supposed to do?" "Fight," Sylva spat, "like the rest of us." It wasn't that simple. Sylva's patience snapped. Sindralith ignited in her hand, its fiery glow casting flickering shadows across the ruins. "Nothing about this war is simple. You made a choice. Now face the consequences." The informant's fear overwhelmed them. They collapsed to their knees, trembling, their hands raised in a futile plea for mercy. "Please," they stammered, tears streaming down their face. "I didn't want this. I had no choice." Sylva didn't lower her swords. Her heart ached with the weight of the moment, but she couldn't waver. "You will tell me everything, every plan, every secret you've shared with them. If you lie, I'll know." They nodded frantically, their words spilling out in a desperate torrent. Sylva listened, her swords held steady, their glow a constant reminder of the power she wielded and the responsibility it carried. When they finished, she stepped back. "You'll come with me. Your fate will be decided by those you betrayed." The informant nodded weakly, their spirit utterly broken. Sylva sheathed her blades, her resolve hardening once more. The forest around her seemed to exhale, its stillness echoing Sylva's fragile reprieve. Yet the tension lingered in her chest, a grim reminder of shattered trust and the daunting uncertainty of what lay ahead. But as she led the informant away, her thoughts churned. Trust was fragile, and now it felt more elusive than ever. The path ahead would demand more than strength and skill. It would demand clarity, and she wasn't sure how much she had left to give. Sylva stepped out of the forest, the morning light casting the land in shades of gold and amber. The informant trudged behind her, their shoulders slumped, their gaze fixed on the ground. The tension between them was palpable, a fragile thread stretched taut by betrayal and necessity. Sylva's grip on her resolve steadied as she scanned the horizon, searching for their next waypoint. The journey back to her faction's stronghold was arduous. The terrain shifted from dense forest to rolling plains dotted with jagged outcroppings of rock. Each step reminded her of the burden she bore, not only the informant's betrayal, but the countless lives relying on her unwavering resolve. The resonance of Thaloran and Sindralith, faint but ever present, served as a solemn accompaniment to her thoughts. Halfway through their trek, Sylva's instincts flared. She raised a hand, halting the informant. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice low but firm. The air shifted, a subtle disturbance that prickled the edges of her awareness. From the shadows of a rocky alcove, figures emerged, 5 soldiers clad in dark armor, their weapons glinting menacingly. The leader, a burly man with a scar tracing the length of his jaw, stepped forward. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "The infamous Sylva. And look, you've brought us a little gift." Sylva's emerald gaze locked onto him, unflinching. "Step aside." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, I don't think so. See, that informant of yours has a hefty price on their head. And you? Well, let's just say we've all been eager to meet you." The soldiers fanned out, their movements coordinated, their intent clear. Sylva's hands found the hilts of her swords, their familiar heft anchoring her focus. She inhaled deeply, centering herself. The leader smirked. "Last chance to make this easy. Hand the informant over, and we might let you live." Sylva drew Thaloran and Sindralith in one fluid motion, their glow intensifying as they met the open air. "Come and take them," she replied, her voice a razor's edge. The fight erupted with brutal efficiency. Sylva moved like a force of nature, her swords a blur of golden light and fiery destruction. Thaloran slowed time around her enemies, their strikes faltering as if caught in molasses. She used the openings to deliver precise, crippling blows. Sindralith countered with raw, explosive power, each swing leaving scorched trails in its wake. The soldiers fought with ferocity, but their efforts faltered before her unparalleled skill. She ducked under a wide swing, Thaloran slicing through a soldier's armor with flawless accuracy. Another lunged at her from behind, but a backward thrust of Sindralith ended his charge in a burst of fiery embers. The leader snarled, charging with a heavy axe raised high. Sylva met his attack head-on, her blades crossing to catch the blow. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the ground. "You should have run," Sylva hissed, pushing him back with a surge of strength. She followed with a devastating cross-slash, the combined energy of her swords tearing through his defenses. The leader crumpled, his weapon clattering to the ground. The battlefield fell silent, the air heavy with the tang of scorched earth and bloodied metal. Sylva stood amidst the carnage, her chest rising and falling steadily. The informant peeked out from their hiding spot, their face pale. "You didn't have to kill them all," they whispered. Sylva sheathed her swords, her expression unreadable. They left no other option. The rest of the journey passed in strained silence. When the stronghold's gates came into view, Sylva felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. But as they approached, the weight of the informant's betrayal loomed larger. The guards at the gate cast wary glances at the pair, their hands hovering near their weapons. Sylva raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. "This one's fate is for the council to decide," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Inside, the council chamber was a stark contrast to the harshness of the world outside. The room was lined with banners bearing the faction's insignia, and a long table dominated the center. Sylva pushed the informant forward, stepping back to let the council deliberate. As the informant began their confession, Sylva stood at the edge of the room, her thoughts distant. The path ahead demanded more than she could see clearly, but for now, she had done what was needed. Trust, she thought, isn't earned back in a single moment, but it can be rebuilt, one step at a time. The council chamber's heavy oak doors creaked open as Sylva stepped into the warm light of the morning sun. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadow. Her shoulders bore the weight of the council's decision, their words echoing in her mind. The artifact must be retrieved at all costs. Without it, the balance could tip beyond repair. Sylva tightened her grip on Thaloran and Sindralith, their subtle hums steadying her resolve. This was not a mission she could afford to fail. Sylva's journey began at dawn, joined by 3 warriors assigned to her by the council. The group was a mix of skill and temperament. Kieran, a stoic archer with piercing blue eyes and a silent efficiency. Leora, a fiery swordswoman with a tendency to challenge authority. Darren, a healer whose calm demeanor masked a sharp mind. They traveled on horseback, the terrain shifting from rolling hills to jagged cliffs as the hours passed. Sylva's presence loomed over the group, her silence an unspoken command. "So," Leora finally broke the quiet, her tone edged with curiosity, "why send you on a recovery mission? Seems like overkill." Sylva glanced at her, emerald eyes shimmering with guarded intensity. "Because failure isn't an option." Leora scoffed, but said no more. The others exchanged glances but followed Sylva's lead without question. By mid-afternoon, the group reached the border of the Forbidden Lands. The air grew thick, the light dimming as twisted trees cast eerie shadows over the path. Ancient stone markers lined the trail, their surfaces etched with runes worn smooth by time. The faint sound of whispers carried on the wind, chilling even the most stalwart among them. "Stay close," Sylva ordered, her voice firm. The group obeyed, their weapons drawn as they moved through the treacherous terrain. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, riddled with hidden traps. More than once, Sylva's keen senses saved them from triggering a deadly mechanism. As they pressed deeper, memories began to surface in Sylva's mind, fragmented images of her younger self, training under the harsh guidance of her mentor. The day she first touched Thaloran flashed vividly before her. The golden blade had hummed in her hands, its resonance aligning with her very soul. The silence was broken by the sharp twang of a bowstring. An arrow whizzed past Sylva's ear, embedding itself in a tree trunk. She raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. "Ambush!" Kieran shouted, loosing an arrow into the shadows. Enemies emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by masks, their movements quick and coordinated. Sylva unsheathed her blades, their glow cutting through the gloom. Thaloran emitted a steady resonance, slowing the attacker's movements. Sylva moved with lethal grace, her blades unleashing decisive strikes that cut through the tumult. She wove through the chaos with purpose, striking down her enemies in a seamless flow of motion, parrying a spear thrust with Syndralith and countering with a fiery arc that left her opponent staggering. Before Sylva could react, Kieran loosed a pair of arrows with perfect synchronicity, the shafts finding their marks with unerring accuracy. The enemy crumpled mid-lunge, their weapon falling uselessly to the ground. Kieran stood poised, his bow an extension of himself, each shot executed with a fluid grace that spoke of mastery. Sparks and ash filled the air as Sylva turned to meet another foe, her trust in Kieran's vigilance absolute. The rest of the group fought valiantly, while Leora's blade danced with unrelenting ferocity. Darren worked in the background, shielding and healing as needed. But it was Sylva who turned the tide of the battle, her movements an artful combination of power and grace. Within moments, the ambushers lay defeated, the forest eerily silent once more. As dusk fell, the group arrived at an ancient temple hewn into the face of a towering cliff. Two colossal statues flanked the entrance, their weathered forms exuding an intimidating presence. Sylva advanced cautiously, her blades ready for whatever lay beyond. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The group entered cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. At the center of the sanctuary, the artifact rested on a stone pedestal, its surface glowing faintly with a pulsing light. Before they could approach, a figure stepped from the shadows. Clad in dark armor, the Guardian's presence was overwhelming. They wielded a massive warhammer, its head crackling with dark energy. "You will not take what is not yours," the Guardian rumbled, their voice reverberating through the room. Sylva stepped forward, her emerald eyes locked onto the foe. "I wasn't asking." The sanctuary descended into turmoil as the Guardians surged forward. Sylva intercepted their charge, Thaloran absorbing the hammer's force with a brilliant clash of light and sound. The impact sent shockwaves through the room, dislodging dust and debris. "Kieran, cover Leora. Darren, stay back," Sylva barked, her commands sharp and decisive. The battle was ferocious, the Guardian's strength matched only by Sylva's calculated finesse. Every swing of the warhammer clashed against masterful ripostes, Syndralith striking with fiery ferocity, while Thaloran disrupted the Guardian's movements. The clash of weapons created a symphony of destruction, casting the room in a cascade of brilliance and resonant echoes. Sylva spotted the slightest falter in the Guardian's stance, a fleeting vulnerability. With a sudden pivot, she darted left, Syndralith slashing with searing intensity, its force compelling the Guardian to overreach. Exploiting the opening, she surged forward, Thaloran thrusting with unrelenting force, cleaving through their defenses with unstoppable precision. The golden blade shone with an intense luminescence, shattering armor with a burst of radiant energy that reverberated through the atrium, bringing the Guardians' movements to an abrupt halt. The warhammer fell from their grasp. The chamber stilled, and the artifact's glow pulsed rhythmically, as though marking their triumph. As the group retrieved the artifact, Sylva's gaze lingered on her companions. She saw the strain in their eyes, the unspoken questions and doubts. But for now, they had succeeded. "Let's move," she said, turning toward the exit. The artifact's glow illuminated their path as they stepped back into the night, the air thick with the promise of challenges yet to come. The journey back from the temple was heavy with silence. Sylva's grip on the artifact's satchel tightened as they navigated the uneven terrain. The artifact's faint glow seeped through the fabric, casting ominous patterns that danced with each step. The group's usual camaraderie was replaced by uneasy glances and unspoken tension. Leora was the first to break the silence. "We've been walking for hours. Maybe we should rest." Her tone held a sharp edge, masking her exhaustion. Sylva glanced over her shoulder, her emerald gaze piercing. "Not yet. We need more distance from the temple. That artifact is a beacon for trouble." Kieran nodded silently, his bow slung but his fingers twitching as if ready to draw an arrow at a moment's notice. Darren trudged behind them, his normally calm demeanor strained. beads of sweat lining his brow. As dusk fell, the group's path led them through a dense forest. The canopy above seemed to swallow the fading light, leaving the path ahead cloaked in shadow. Whispers began to weave through the air, soft and indistinct at first, like echoes from the edges of memory. Leora's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" Darren shook his head, his voice uneasy. "It's just the wind." But Sylva knew better. Her connection to Thalorin and Cinderlith hummed faintly in her hands, their resonance almost in sync with the artifact's glow. She halted abruptly, scanning the shadows. "Stay close. Don't stray from the path." The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if calling each of them by name. Kieran's grip tightened on his bow. Leora's fiery defiance faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. Darren muttered a prayer under his breath. The forest opened to reveal an abandoned outpost, its stone walls cracked and overtaken by vines. Weapons lay scattered, their edges unnaturally sharp despite years of neglect. The air was thick, charged with an energy that seemed to emanate from the artifact itself. Sylva gestured for the group to halt. "We'll rest here. Kieran, scout the perimeter. Leora, help Darren set up a fire." Kieran slipped into the shadows, his movements silent. The others busied themselves with camp, though their unease was palpable. Sylva placed the artifact on a flat stone, its glow intensifying as she stepped back to observe it. Leora glanced at her, hesitating. "Does it feel heavier to you, like it's pressing down on us?" Sylva's gaze didn't waver. "It's not just weight, it's power, and power always comes at a cost." As the fire crackled weakly, the group gathered around it. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional snap of burning wood. Leora's patience finally snapped. "Why are we even trusting this thing?" she demanded, pointing at the artifact. "It's already messing with us. The whispers, the shadows. How long before it does something worse?" Darren's voice was calm but firm. "We don't understand its nature yet. Jumping to conclusions won't help." Leora scoffed. "And ignoring it will?" She turned to Sylva. "You're the leader. What's your plan? Or are we just going to carry this thing blindly until it destroys us?" Sylva's voice cut through the tension, steady and sharp. "We carry it because we have no choice. If you can't handle that, you can leave." Leora's glare softened slightly, but the fire in her eyes didn't extinguish. She fell silent, and the group returned to their uneasy stillness. Later, as the others rested, Sylva sat alone near the artifact. Its glow cast strange patterns on the surrounding stones, shifting with an almost sentient rhythm. She closed her eyes, gripping her swords tightly, and let their resonance steady her mind. Her mentor's words echoed in her memory. "The burden of power isn't the strength to wield it, it's the will to use it wisely." Sylva's jaw tightened. She couldn't afford to waver. Whatever this artifact truly was, she would see it delivered. The group's survival depended on her strength, even if the weight of it felt unbearable. When dawn broke, the group packed their belongings in silence. The artifact's glow dimmed in the daylight, though its presence was no less oppressive. Sylva turned to her companions, her voice firm. "We move. Stay sharp." As they stepped onto the path ahead, Sylva's resolve solidified. Whatever darkness the artifact carried, she would bear it. The whispers in her mind weren't just a warning, they were a promise. Sylva moved silently through the dense forest, her twin swords resting comfortably in their scabbards on her back. Each step was measured, her senses attuned to the rhythm of the woodland around her. The air was heavy with anticipation, every sound amplified as if the forest itself held its breath. The song of iron and flame hummed faintly, a melodic undercurrent only she could hear, guiding her steps toward the hidden path ahead. Her destination was the ruins of Kaeldor, a long-abandoned fortress said to hold secrets about the fates who had forged her swords. The whispers of a scholar in the rebel camp had sparked this journey. The scholar, an aging keeper of forgotten lore named Valric, had shared fragmented tales of an ancient chamber said to house the threads of destiny. According to Valric, the chamber was a place where the fates themselves once wove the fabric of existence, leaving behind powerful echoes of their craft. These stories hinted at truths Sylva could not ignore, truths that might finally reveal her connection to the swords and her purpose in the balance of the world. Sylva needed answers, not just about her weapons, but about her role in the grand design of fate. As she approached a clearing, the hum in her swords grew louder, signaling danger. She crouched low, scanning the area. Her sharp eyes caught movement. Imperial soldiers, a scouting party, setting up an ambush. They had not seen her yet. Sylva's mind raced. She could engage them head-on, a bold, albeit perilous option given the possibility of reinforcements lurking nearby, or she could trust her agility and knowledge of the forest to outmaneuver them. Each path carried risk, but her instincts leaned towards stealth, favoring precision over brute force. The latter choice required precision and patience, but it aligned with her instincts and training. Years of evading larger forces had taught her the value of striking unseen. Her mission was too critical to risk. Stealth would keep the Empire unaware of her path for just a little longer. The decision was swift. She would not risk alerting the Empire to her mission. She drew Thalarin, its blade shimmering with a faint silver glow. The song shifted to a slower tempo as she activated its power to slow time. Sylva moved like a shadow, each step deliberate and silent. She crept past the soldiers, their movements appearing sluggish, their voices distorted as if underwater. Once she was clear of the ambush site, Sylva released the sword's power. Time snapped back to normal, and the song resumed its harmonious cadence. She exhaled, allowing herself a moment of relief before pressing onward. The ruins of Kaeldor loomed ahead, a haunting silhouette against the twilight sky. Vines and moss covered the crumbling stone walls, but the grandeur of the structure was still evident. Sylva stepped cautiously inside, her senses heightened. The air here was different, charged with an energy that prickled her skin. The central chamber was vast, its ceiling open to the sky, allowing shafts of moonlight to illuminate the space. In the center stood a pedestal of intricately carved obsidian, etched with runic symbols that glowed faintly as if alive. Atop the pedestal rested the Loom of Fates, an ancient construct of otherworldly beauty. Its threads shimmered in hues that defied description, constantly shifting and intertwining in an elegant, mesmerizing dance. Each thread seemed to hum with a unique tone, creating a harmony that resonated deep within Sylva's very soul. It pulsed with life, as though it were breathing, and the air around it seemed heavier, charged with an indescribable energy. Sylva approached, her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the Loom of Fates. Before she could examine it further, a figure emerged from the shadows. Clad in dark armor, etched with crimson runes that glowed faintly like smoldering embers, the figure moved with deliberate menace. Each step they took was measured, the weight of their presence growing heavier with every motion. Their helmet, shaped like the visage of a snarling beast, obscured their face, but piercing red eyes shone through the slits. The air around them seemed to ripple with heat, and their gauntleted hands flexed as though eager to strike. Every movement exuded precision and deadly intent, amplifying the weight of their presence. The Empire had beaten her here. "You must be Sylva," the figure said, their voice cold and sharp. "We've been expecting you." Sylva gripped her swords, the song rising into a fierce and commanding symphony. This was no ordinary enemy. The battle for the Loom, and perhaps for fate itself, was about to begin. The air vibrated with the hum of the Loom of Fates, its threads shimmering as if sensing the clash about to unfold. Sylva stood her ground, her twin swords drawn and gleaming under the moonlight that filtered through the ruined chamber. Her stance was unyielding, her jaw clenched with determination, and her eyes burned with fierce resolve as if daring the enemy to strike first. Across from her, the armored figure radiated raw menace, their crimson runes pulsating in rhythm with the energy coursing through the loom. The enemy struck first, lunging forward with a blade wreathed in dark fire. Sylva parried, her swords singing as they clashed against the infernal steel. Sparks flew. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the chamber. Dust and fragments of stone shook loose from the walls, cascading to the floor in a thunderous echo. The battle erupted into a blur of movement. Sylva twisted and spun, her blades carving luminous arcs through the air. Thalorin's silver glow created an eerie trail as it slowed the enemy's strikes to a crawl, while Cinderlith blazed red-hot, her accelerated counters striking like bolts of lightning. She pivoted on one foot, ducking beneath a fiery lash and retaliating with a sweeping strike that nearly disarmed her opponent. Each clash of steel resonated through the chamber, mingling with the hum of the loom and the crackling of the enemy's molten shield. The air became thick with heat and magic, the loom's threads vibrating violently as the chaos unfolded. A blow caught her off guard. The figure's fist, wreathed in fiery power, slammed into her side, sending her sprawling across the chamber floor. Pain exploded through her ribs as she struggled to catch her breath. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sharp ache in her side and the taste of blood on her lips. She gritted her teeth, anger flaring at the thought of failing here in this crucial moment. Memories of her people, their faces filled with hope, surged forward, fueling her resolve. She pressed her hand to the cold stone beneath her, forcing herself to rise despite the screaming protest of her body. The figure closed in, their blade raised for a finishing strike. Sylva clenched her jaw, steeling herself for the inevitable when a blinding bolt of energy streaked through the chamber, striking the armored enemy and forcing them back. She turned to see her party rushing into the room, Kieran, his bow drawn and releasing arrows with silent precision. Leora, her fiery hair illuminated by the crackling energy as she charged forward with her blade, and Darren, his calm expression belied by the glowing magic swirling around his hands. "We couldn't let you have all the fun," Leora called. Her voice was sharp and defiant as she deflected a molten whip with her sword. Darren knelt beside Sylva immediately, his hands glowing with a soothing light that cast warm, flickering reflections across the cracked stone floor. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice steady. A warm wave of energy coursed through Sylva, mending the bruises on her ribs and clearing the fog from her vision. "You're not done yet." Sylva nodded, gratitude flooding her as she rose to her feet, the pain ebbing with every breath. Her reinforcements bought her time to recover, though the armored enemy now faced them all, their movements growing more frantic and destructive. The loom of fates reacted violently, its threads sparking with arcs of energy that tore through the air, casting flickering shadows across the chamber. The chamber became a battlefield of chaos. Kieran's arrows struck with pinpoint accuracy, forcing the enemy to deflect them, while Leora's relentless strikes created openings for Sylva. Darren maintained a protective barrier, his focus unwavering as he occasionally hurled bursts of healing light at his companions. The armored figure's weapons shifted rapidly, from flaming blades to fiery chains that coiled through the air, leaving trails of molten heat in their wake. Sylva seized the moment, her swords humming in harmony as she called upon their full power. Thalorin's time-slowing aura spread, giving her allies the edge they needed, while Sindralith's acceleration turned her into a whirlwind of motion. Her strikes were a blur, each one faster and more precise, creating a dazzling rhythm that overwhelmed the enemy's defenses. The enemy lashed out, sending waves of molten energy that shattered the stone floor and sent Darren tumbling. Sylva roared, her movements a blur as she closed the distance, dodging the fiery assault. He leapt high, both swords raised, and brought them down in a devastating cross-slash. The impact released a shockwave of radiant light and searing heat that engulfed the enemy. The loom itself reacted, its threads glowing brighter as though harmonizing with the power of Sylva's final strike. When the light faded, the armored figure knelt, their weapons shattered and their crimson runes dimmed. They raised their head, their red eyes flickering. "This isn't over," they rasped, before vanishing in a burst of shadowy smoke. Sylva collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving. The chamber fell silent, save for the faint hum of the loom. Her party rushed to her side again. Darren knelt, his magic already working to close the deeper wounds. "You're reckless," he muttered, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. "But you'll live." "They were after the loom," Sylva said, her voice hoarse. "We have to protect it." Kieran stepped forward, his piercing blue eyes scanning the chamber. "If the Empire knows about this place, they won't stop." Leora helped Sylva to her feet, her fiery demeanor tempered by concern. "Then we move fast. We're not losing this fight." The loom of fates shimmered, its threads weaving a quiet melody that resonated through the chamber. It stood in stark contrast to the chaos and fury that had consumed the space moments before. Its serene glow seemed to wash away the remnants of violence, a reminder of the fragile balance Sylva was destined to protect. Sylva stared at it, a sense of purpose hardening in her chest. The battle was over, but the war had just begun.